with that, I'll turn it over to Conrad.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. And can everybody hear me okay? I'm not used to using a mic, so thanks all for coming. Yeah, my name is Conrad Albrecht-Buehler, and I'm really excited to be here. This is my first visit to Google, and it's a real pleasure. So I suppose I should start by talking about this sort of premise, explaining this premise a little bit, that monitoring UIs suck. It's not exactly that they suck. It's that I think they're incomplete. And I'm going to try to make the case that they're incomplete because monitoring UIs in general support analytical activities and not evaluative ones. And this distinction between analysis and evaluation, I'm going to base on the distinction between trying to draw objective conclusions from the interface as opposed to trying to draw subjective conclusions based on the interface. So to do this, I'm going to tell you three stories about three user stories about monitoring. I'm going to tell you about the difficulties each person had with the monitoring tool that they already use and the monitoring tasks that they're trying to accomplish. And I'll discuss the situations that are important to them and how they each perform their different monitoring tasks. Each story is going to be an example that shows you that users are competing for their time with the monitoring task as well as many other responsibilities. And these are all going to be examples where alarms and dashboards don't always work. And to do this, I'm going to discuss the situations that are important to them. I use the stories as an example of these monitoring problems, and the approach that I'll discuss is based on this idea that people are monitoring for a situation that they want to identify what's worth paying attention to. That's the way in which they monitor, as opposed to trying to identify what sort of action they need to take. That it's essentially, hey, look at this, is what a monitoring activity is trying to result in, as opposed to, hey, take care of this. So the first story I'm going to tell you about is about monitoring servers. The second one is about monitoring business performance by reading financial reports. And the last one is going to be about a person who's trying to monitor their user's experience in a discussion forum. So our first story is about a CTO who's working in a small entrepreneurship. The company's business is based on a website, and he's in charge of everything technical at the company. So he's the lead developer, but he also has executive duties where he's trying to raise funds and do job interviews. He's the systems admin, so he's in charge of all the equipment, all the servers. And one of the things that he monitors is the performance of his web server, his mail server, and his database application server. So he's got some powerful dashboards, but he ends up rarely using them. In part, it's because it's a lot of work for him just to look at them and find out what's relevant in these things. I mean, take a look at how big these things can be. I mean, they require a significant amount of mental effort to spot and then assemble the data that's relevant to a particular situation that he's trying to look out for. And this gets us to the first reason why I think monitoring UIs suck, which is that they don't take into account the fact that users have many other responsibilities besides monitoring, and that monitoring, as a result, has to be done very quickly. We're not all air traffic controllers who can spend all our attention focused on just this task of monitoring. Sorry, knocking this around a little bit. So now, I've heard a lot of people describe these displays as easy to read, and in fact, even that they could be read at a glance, but I don't buy it. These sorts of dashboards really require a significant amount of mental effort to parse. The display conveys individual sensor conditions. The user then has to identify which condition they need to pay attention to first, then they've got to peruse their mental model of how the system works to figure out which situation such a condition could reflect, and then decide to look into that situation. In part, this is why the people who monitor who manage network systems admin don't end up using the dashboards themselves. They want to know how the servers, want to know if the servers are sort of doing all right, but they don't necessarily have the time or the expertise to dig in there and identify all the situations. So what they end up doing is they just end up asking their admins, knocking on the door and saying, hey, is everything all right? In fact, our CTO had a similar problem when anybody in the company wanted to, when people in the marketing group wanted to release, put out a press release, they had to go check and make sure that the load on the servers was okay, just in case there was a whole lot of activity that resulted from that. So when designing these sorts of monitoring interfaces, the design effort is primarily focused on highlighting conditions. But the highlighting is there to help us filter. So why not filter? We could just pull out the particular conditions that are maybe relevant instead of just trying to highlight them. Now, the worst thing about some of these interfaces is how many of them use the red and green mapping to identify stuff. And I'm sure by now you're all sort of tired of hearing about people complaining about use of red and green in interfaces because 10% of the population can't distinguish them. So, but this is actually one of my favorite things about Google Analytics is that its default is blue. So most people can actually see that. But my very favorite aspect of Google Analytics is actually the custom reports. So being able to create custom dashboard views that really goes a long way to simplifying the monitoring activity. It lets you filter the data and show only what's relevant to a particular situation. But even that sort of fails once the situations scale up. I mean, what happens if you have to administrate 30 different sites or even just a couple of sites, but you want to monitor for all kinds of different situations? Are you supposed to page through each one of these different reports? At some point, it all sort of gets meta, and you need a filter on the reports themselves. So so at least we can define a couple of initial design goals at this point. At least try to reduce the mental effort for the person trying to parse the UI, and try to use something other than highlighting. And being able to customize the filter, being able to customize and filter the data really helps a lot in identifying what's going to be relevant to a particular situation. These aren't really like lofty design goals. I mean, we see this already. We should maybe see it a little more often, but it's a good place to start. So back to our CTO. So if he's not using the dashboards to monitor service, what's he using? So he works on his servers throughout the day, updating applications, installing patches, etc. And when he happens to be logged into one of these servers, when he's logging out or if he's got a quick moment, he'll tend to run uptime and just look at the load on the server. So he's sort of just sampling it. So if he happens to catch it at a moment where there's high load, and if he's got some time, he'll investigate the situation. In other words, is the server load high enough that he needs to investigate? High enough. So what is high enough? That's a pretty subjective description. What might be high enough to me isn't necessarily high enough to him. He's making a subjective evaluation from this objective information. If what he actually does to monitor, so if this is what he actually does to monitor servers, at least we should try to support that activity. If that's what he's comfortable with, and that's I was worrying, we should try to maybe support that. Now, implicit in this question of is it high enough for me to investigate is another question, which is there enough time for me to investigate this? Remember, he has a lot of other responsibilities, and just just the fact that the load is high doesn't mean that he's going to cancel an interview that he's scheduled to go do that. Sometimes it's just got to stay high, and this is one of these other problems about monitoring servers. He had no idea, he might not know that something is going to come up. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So essentially what he's asking is, really, is it important enough for me to investigate? And so this is the cornerstone of how I think we can improve monitoring UIs. We need another kind of monitoring UI that tells us that there's something important enough for us to turn our attention to the monitor and begin monitoring. Now, doesn't that sound sort of suspiciously a lot like an alarm? Couldn't our CTO just use an alarm to tell him that his server load was high? I mean, alarms are actually another kind of monitoring UI, but alarms have their own sets of problems. The first of which is you never know that they're coming. The next is that they force you to act even if you can't. Even if he has an interview scheduled, he's got an alarm going off. And if you can't address them, if you can't address that alarm immediately, what do? You can cancel the alarm, and then you may not remember later that you had a problem. You can ignore the alarm, but then it's just going to continue to go off. And you can snooze the alarm, but in a few minutes you may just be in the same boat you were already in. So our CTO actually has a whole bunch of alarms that he uses to monitor for incidents, but he mostly ignores them. He filters them into their own mailbox, and he never looks at them. Sometimes, if something stops working entirely, he'll go back into this sort of cache of alerts and use it to try to diagnose what went wrong. So what time did the problem start, and try to use that as a diagnostic tool, or actually as an analytical tool. He does use one other sort of alarm pretty regularly, though. Sometimes someone from his customer support team will tell him that they're getting angry calls. So you could say that he's actually letting his customers sort of monitor the systems for him and act as an alert system. But obviously, that's not ideal. So let's look more closely at why an alarm doesn't work for his particular uptime monitoring. Here's a quick graph of server load. So is the load high? So that's what I mean by subjective. To me, it's not, I wouldn't think server load was high until it got to 0.9, but to him, above 0.7 is high. So he can set an alarm. But here's the problem with the alarm. If it goes off, he won't necessarily have time to drop everything to investigate. And when he does have time, the alarm doesn't tell him anything about his server. And so the problem is that this is what the alarm does. It basically divides the data range into the data he should ignore and the data that he should attend to. Remember, he said that he'd investigate if the load was high enough, and an alarm just tells him that it's high. And what's more is it only tells him that once it's happened, nothing at all before. But the graph here would tell us more. He can see how it's changing. He can see where it is, where it's been, but it's at a cost. He has to interpret that graph, and he's already dismissed using that for that same reason. And furthermore, it takes up a lot more screen real estate. Obviously, the alarm doesn't necessarily take up any, and this takes up quite a bit. In part, this is why network operation centers look like this, where you just have tons and tons of monitors. The graphs enable an operator in like an operation center to interpret the sensor conditions, but the screen real estate cost is really significant. So maybe there's something in between a graph and an alarm that we could come up with that might help us. So instead, what if we change how the data range is divided up? So instead, from this to this. Instead of showing the whole graph, we could just show the region prior to the alarm threshold. Then the position in the region can identify the importance of attending to that situation. If the data is below the ignore threshold, it might as well be at that ignore threshold. Doesn't matter how low it is, and no matter how high it gets, we can assume it's just at that attend threshold. We still need to go look in on the situation. So the range in between enables us to indicate that there's this degree of importance to attending to the situation. I just refer to this range as heed. The closer it gets to the alarm threshold, the more important it becomes for him to attend to the situation. And since our CTO wants to know if the load is high enough now, we don't need to show the whole graph. We could just show the current position in the range. And so now we can offer him a really simple little dashboard that relies on the way he's already monitoring his servers. One that doesn't give him too much detail and can still help him decide if he should turn his attention to monitoring those servers. And it does so continuously. So when he has time, he can quickly identify if there's something that he should investigate. And by making this dashboard sort of easily and persistently visible, he can actually constantly evaluate the servers and actually start to develop this sort of awareness of how often his servers get heavily loaded and for how long they stay heavily loaded. So deciding to investigate his servers is a tactical decision, and one he ends up needing to make several times a day. But what about situations that that happen far less frequently? So let me tell you a little bit about a CEO that I work with that had a very different sort of monitoring problem. She's in charge of a medium-sized company that offers services online. And she's launched several programs recently to grow the business and needs to keep an eye on the performance of those programs. However, she doesn't need to look in on them every day. Once a week is probably enough, or maybe even every other week. But she, like our CTO, has too many other responsibilities and is constantly dealing with sort of more immediately urgent situations and problems. As a result, she often feels quite a bit of anxiety over the performance of these programs, and she doesn't really, and as a result of that anxiety, she is more likely to put off even reading those reports. And so it can sometimes take her a long, long time to read those reports and then end up missing something that happens that maybe if she'd known about sooner, she could have caught. And so she manages it by reading sort of little reports sort of like this that are generated for her. And if the report shows that there's a program that's not performing well enough, or based on her particular expectations, then she might go investigate it, talk to her marketing team, talk to the technical people and find out if maybe there's something wrong with the data. But in many ways, it's a lot like our CTO's server monitoring problem now, except that the values just don't change very quickly. They change very, very slowly. So at least we can try to maybe apply a similar solution. So here we could see how close each of her clients are to being underperformers. We could just show her these 4 indicators, but what happens when this program grows to 20 clients or 200 clients? We need some way to sort of compact all that. We can't just give her 200 of these little indicators. So let's just assign some values to that heed range and make it a scale. So we can set 0 to the minimum heed and 1 to the maximum heed. And now we can elect the maximum value to represent the whole report. And what that means is that instead of saying client M is underperforming and needs your attention, it's saying there's something in this report that needs your attention. So take your time to find some time to pay attention to it. It says essentially that unless the whole report or the whole program that is performing well, that she should take some time to investigate. Well, essentially that's really an OR operation on all of these. And that's a useful sort of starting point for building complex situation monitoring. Now she has a single representation that summarizes the whole report, this sort of last little indicator. And if we again make it sort of persistently visible, she can use it to stay aware of how the programs are performing. And if it looks like there's something in the program that needs her attention, she can delve into the display. She can first get more detail on the evaluation and see how all the individual clients are being evaluated, and then she can dig in and see the actual data. And so this is another way we can improve monitoring UIs. Again, this isn't entirely a new idea, but we want to show a minimum amount of detail that enables us to make a quick evaluation, but then enable the user to dig in and get more detail as they need it, as they are trying to go from making an evaluation to analyzing the situation. So working with CEO had some surprising results, actually. She thought she didn't use the interface. During testing, she would apologize that she didn't have time, she was doing all these other things. But when I would question her, she actually knew exactly where the indicator was in the display and how the program was performing, which was very surprising. She didn't think she knew anything, but she was actually developing this awareness. And the most surprising thing was that she showed a marked decrease in her anxiety about this program. And as a result, she asked if I would build her more monitoring tools to monitor other aspects of her business but those aspects she was asking me to build the tools were the things that were causing her the most stress. And so it was as if she was asking me to build these things to help combat the anxiety. And that's certainly a very good goal for all of us who are trying to build monitoring UIs, to try to help increase our users' confidence in the situations and their awareness of those situations, and thereby reduce their anxiety. So some situations people monitor that they aren't, some of the situations that people monitor for are ones that they aren't familiar yet with and they want to learn about. The next monitoring story that I want to tell you about is about a guy who's a sole developer of a website that's a community forum for a whole lot of people. Now his site is co-located, and so he doesn't really worry about the servers. He lets the co-location company worry about that. But instead what he wants to monitor is the experience that his users have on the site. So now he didn't necessarily know how to monitor for, or he couldn't necessarily describe the good experiences, but he could at least identify bad experiences that he didn't want them to have. So in particular, he didn't want them to have any sort of access restriction to the site, and he didn't want them to experience what he described as an unbalanced forum. So in terms of access restriction, what he meant was that he told me the story about his building of the site. So he has his own custom forum that he built in Ruby, and he's the sole developer of the site. But one of the things that happens to him is he's constantly modifying the code, trying to add new features, trying to improve its performance. And along the way, one time he accidentally made a typo. And what happened was that a subset of his users couldn't log in. It wasn't that they all couldn't, he could still log in, but it was just a subset who could no longer log in because of this error. And he didn't even find out about this for a couple of weeks. And the only way he found out about it was that he had contact with people on the forum outside of the forum. He found out about it when he was talking to a friend on the phone who's also a user and say, hey, why haven't I been able to access the site for a couple of weeks? And he had no idea. He had to go and discover that there was this other problem. So he too was sort of he was using his customers were monitoring the situation for him, but he didn't want that to happen again. He had a similar problem again later where it ended up that a subset of users could no longer post or reply to posts in the forum. So he definitely didn't want that to happen again. So what the situation he was describing that he was trying to monitor for is, again, where users couldn't log in or when they couldn't post or reply. The thing is that there could be a day where there's a whole lot of posting activity. There's a whole lot of new activity. There's a new event that really affects the community, so everyone's sort of voicing their opinion. Or it could be a day where there's a whole lot of replies, where there's a really hot topic and everyone wants to join in and talk about it. But he cares about a situation where neither is occurring to identify that somehow something is broken in the code that allows people to post or reply. And so that's essentially an AND operation on these two, but not a logical AND where you're sort of picking the minimum, but a compensatory measure. You're essentially saying that you care about a situation where if somebody can't post, maybe that might, because people are not posting, that doesn't mean they can't post. But maybe you should still look into it. And so maybe we'll push that up sort of halfway. But if they aren't posting and they aren't replying, then we have a situation we need to look into. And we'll push it up. He also talked about this notion of unbalanced. And what he described as what amounted to an unbalanced forum was a situation where either there were too many posts or too many replies, and it basically felt like there was so much activity that a new user wouldn't be able to join in the activity. They would feel like they were just an outsider. There was too much going on. And another thing he wanted to look out for was a situation where there were too many dud posts. What he described as a dud post was where somebody posted a subject, started a thread, but nobody replied to it. If there were a whole lot of these sort of dud posts, he said it would feel like it was a really dead forum and nobody would want to join in. So he was trying to monitor for this sort of like negative user experience in the forum. But the problem is he had no idea what it meant to have too many of these things because he had no data. He was always using his gut to make decisions about whether to intervene as a forum moderator. He didn't have any real data. But since it's built on Rails, it was really easy to instrument the site and get some data out and see how much people were posting. But now he needed to learn. He needed to figure out what those values were, what meant for it to be high. So we built him a little monitoring display in the same sort of way as the other two. And then over time, it allowed him to make modifications. And the way that happened was he would see the keyed value sort of move up, and then he would go look in on the situation if it was high, and he would say, he would make an evaluation, say, you know what, in this situation, it's not so bad. This is fine. This isn't too many. And then he would be able to take the slider and drag it down to where he figured it belonged. Maybe it was just a little bit, something was going on, or like, no, this is totally fine, and you could just drag it all the way down. And that allowed him to basically interact with this evaluation directly. But really all that he was doing is just sort of moving those two thresholds in that range. Since the data point is fixed, the thresholds define where the value ends up residing. So if you pull the slider down, you're just moving the ignore boundary up. It's like this. That way he's able to eventually develop, have the system reflect his experience. But this is another really important aspect of sort of performing subjective evaluation. The information that we present must sort of reflect that person's unique individual knowledge. And as a result, it's really important that that person's knowledge is going to change frequently over time. They're going to learn more as they become more expert. The situation that they're trying to monitor for is going to change because maybe there are more users joining, or you're loading up new servers. The situation is constantly changing. So the monitoring UIs really need to encourage frequent revision. Now, since he wanted to maintain a sort of a comfortable forum for his users, it was really important that he would be able to step in before the situation deteriorated. In other words, he really wanted to know if the situation was sort of building. And this is where the graph would really come in handy instead of just that little slider. But we still just wanted to make that evaluation. We didn't necessarily need to give him a whole lot of detail. So we can still treat it as an evaluation. But since we don't need to give, since the detail doesn't really matter, it doesn't to him. It doesn't matter if there's 33 posts or 36 posts or 112 posts. It matters just that it's sort of getting there. So we can downsample the data, which gives us a much more simplified graph, and goes back to this point of you just want to give people who are monitoring the necessary detail that allows them to make that evaluation as quickly as possible. And so the display now shows him sort of the recent history of the situation, which tells him how the situation is changing. In other words, it enables him to sort of forecast the situation. Now, we can show him that forecast more explicitly using what's called a Kalman filter, which is a way of sort of making a statistical forecast. And now we can show him this whole graph, which doesn't just tell him how it's been doing, but it makes an estimate of how it's going to change in the future. So lets him sort of figure out how quickly it's changing, how serious it is, and how much time he has to maybe make a decision to do other things first. So this is what the sort of final display that he was given looks like. But that's still actually a big thing. We're still taking up quite a bit of real estate. That was the problem with the graph in the first place. So we want to keep everything very compact to make it really easy to make that evaluation as quickly as possible. So this little animation shows the relationship between sort of graph view and that original slider view. That now lets you see that you can represent just that state, that evaluation, but also still convey the how it's changing. So here's some more examples of what the two different views might look like. And so the little slider view is sort of intended to sort of convey motion, like those little motion lines in comics where you see a ball flying through the air, and you see most users would be able, actually, depending if they were more used to reading left to right or right to left, they'd have no problem reading this and actually guessing or identifying how quickly it was moving up or down or which direction it was going. But this also adds another step to that delving process. It allows the user to make that quick evaluation, decide if they want to know more, and now they can go in and see just how it's changing. They can expand that little slider, see the whole graph, and get a sense of how it's changing, and then dig in deeper. So our forum ended up learning much more about his users' behavior using this thing. In fact, he learned so much that he ended up instrumenting his whole site with all sorts of other data that he was getting out of the Rails framework. And then he started building his own displays, not ones that I built for him. He just started making his own, modifying them to look for all sorts of other information in his system, because this was a great way for him to learn about how often people perform different actions, how many perform different actions. So looking back over what we've learned about user activity, we can maybe describe some user goals involved in monitoring. The first one is that the user must identify and describe a situation that's of interest to them. And in terms of indicative conditions, remember how our users actually use dashboards. They spot conditions and try to figure out what each of those conditions might indicate. Next, they need a way to quickly perceive that the situation, they need a quick way to perceive the situation and make an evaluation. Has the situation occurred? Is it likely to occur? And when? Then they need a way to investigate the situation, delve into it and analyze what's going on. And finally, they need a way to refine and modify the situation to better reflect what they now understand. Now, I would argue that monitoring UIs are almost entirely designed around the delving stage as they stand today. They give the users as much information as possible and then expect them to sort of sort the wheat from the chaff. If we design monitoring UIs to support all these activities, I'm certain we can make them a whole lot better. And it's not that monitoring UIs don't work at all, but it's that they're incomplete. It's that dashboards and alarms and reports are insufficient. They're analytical tools, and all three situations would have benefited from an additional tool that would help them support making an evaluation. Evaluation is necessary because all these people have many different responsibilities and must constantly decide where to direct their attention. The closer a situation is to developing, the more important it becomes for them to pay attention to it. Tools that aid in making those evaluations more quickly will definitely make the monitoring experience better. So following some of these design goals that I've described along the way, in light of these user goals, I think we can actually go a long way to improving monitoring UIs and how effective they can be and hopefully make them suck a little bit less. So, thanks. Anybody have any questions?
So it seems like a lot of what you're looking at doing is making the data representation more compact, so you can do a lot more on the screen, use a lot more easily in front of you.
Yeah.
Have you considered anything like combining the notion of alerting and evaluation so that like it's below a certain threshold, it doesn't even show in your monitoring console, or it's not even present?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, so if you use those OR operators, you can combine them infinitely. So you can describe situations and then combine all those situations with OR operations. And so only the one that needs your attention is going to pop up. Then when you dig in, you can spot the one that's high and then explore and dig into that. But there's nothing about these displays that tell you to use that they should replace the way in which we, the monitoring tools we have now. They just work in addition. So we definitely still need alarms. When stuff happens, they exceed, there are situations where we know what we need to respond to, like fire, when smoke alarms and stuff, there's only one action to do, get out of here. So if that action is really clear, alarms are excellent. But if it's complicated, we actually end up needing to dig into the situations. It's better if we've got something that works in addition to the alarm. Something that maybe tells us that alarm might go off soon. So maybe go look into this now. Definitely. Nathaniel, right? Nathan. Sorry, you're Nathan, you're Nathaniel. Got it. Thanks.
What further research can come out of everything you've done so far?
Well, I'd say there's definitely at least two important directions. The first one is expanding this to look at all sorts of other operations. So I described this in terms of I quickly introduced the and the or because those are sort of easy to describe in terms of these particular use cases. But when you're actually trying to identify the situation you want to pay attention to, that's actually pretty complicated. And so in that case, you need more complex tools. And the way in which I sort of cope with this is I asked users what they were looking at. And I also asked them what they were looking for. Inevitably, users could answer one of those two questions. They could tell me that they were always looking at this indicator or that indicator, and then I could build up situations that they wanted to pay attention to in a bottom-up fashion by saying, okay, so you've got that sensor that you're paying attention to. What happens if it's reading high? what are, mitigating circumstances. And for mitigating circumstances, you need another operator, something that's called sort of a sensor, not SEN, but CEN, that sort of minimizes the effect of value. And that's, I call it and not, essentially by saying if this is high and this one is not high, then make it low. And that's there are all sorts of logical operators we can build on them. The not is very easy for people to describe because they can often describe what are the things, what describes a normal situation. And then I can take the not of the normal, and so it's basically saying the less normal the situation is, the more important it is you pay attention to it. But there are all sorts of other operations that are worth exploring. And then the next area is building on this to sort of use this. Heat is a way of saying this is something you should look at. But now that we've said that this is something we should look at, we can map that value to other things. So for example, in the visual scheme, so size. If you have a phone status display, and you've got all sorts of information on your phone about the battery life, signal strength, your next appointment, your upcoming to-dos, there are times at which that information is more important than other information on that display. And so now we can map heat instead of to this sort of vertical position to size. And so now as your battery gets lower, the battery indicator gets bigger. And you can define how much that matters to you. If you are a person who has a charger everywhere, that's not necessarily going to get big, but the closer it gets to your next appointment, maybe your appointment can get larger, and you can define that in the same way. But building this sort of knowledge base underneath is a bit of a challenge. But at least what's valuable here is that unlike a lot of other knowledge base tools, this works even if you just at the very beginning. As soon as you have any one point of knowledge, then it works for you at least up to that point. And as you develop more and more knowledge, you can expand that knowledge base and make it more and more useful over time. Jacob?
Tools like this that are sort of dynamic in what they show to you, do you use, I mean, sometimes if the dashboard is absolutely awful, you still know, okay, I need to look at this, this, and this.
Yeah.
So do you lose the ability to look at, as soon as the page opens, you know what to look at or you have to find it?
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. So location of information on any sort of like large information display matters so much. If you start moving those things around, users get totally confused. They have no trust in the display, and it's a real problem. You can definitely continue to use this in and use location as a keep things together. Hold on, let's see. I've got a dashboard picture here somewhere. All right, well, this isn't a great dashboard, but we'll try this one. This one's for a different use case I didn't talk about, but you can keep them all in the same location, and you can display this sort of information all in the same place. But the advantage, one of the things you can do here is there's a unique situation where actually moving things around makes a difference or is valuable. And that's if the way in which they move is entirely predictable or really familiar to a user. So for example, if you sort these, if you sort them highest to lowest, it's okay that they move around because if that's the way the user's interpreting it, that their intention of looking at this is to identify which of these is worth paying attention to, it's okay to move them around and sort them. In fact, I found that it worked really well if, do I have that picture here? I think I do. It worked really well if I took the title off. So the user just saw this, and sorry, by basically just saying there's something that needs your attention. It meant that the user wasn't constantly trying to jump into that analytical stage of just evaluating that there was something that needed their attention. And once it sort of moved up, they could be curious and say, is that something I want to pay attention to? And then when they moused over it, then they get the name, which would basically already indicate I'm already ready to do a little bit of analysis here to find out a little bit more. And so in that case, that ended up actually keeping them from looking at it all the time or trying to make sense of it all the time. It was just saying, it's fine, there's nothing there, or oh, something's popping up, maybe you need to try to make some time for it. John?
So given how important evaluation is, I would think like every monitoring UI would want, it would be good to have the ability to sort of make those adjustments, like you showed with the forum. Like as you kind of refine and you continue to better understand what's good and what's bad. But I'm curious why you didn't have those in the first two examples you showed.
I did.
Okay.
I just didn't. I wanted to tell the story,
Gotcha.
build up to it. So. But yeah, that's actually, that's really vital. So, but I haven't shown you something else as part of this. So that's adjusting how each of the different sort of conditions are being evaluated. But the thing is that the situation constitutes looking at all these different sensors and combining them in these sort of long, and these logical statements. That has to be edited too. That has to be able for the user to change. So if they discover that, this disk is always giving me a problem, but I know about that disk is going to get changed, or that's particular to that server. I don't care about that aspect of it. I need to add that to my sort of logical description. That I didn't show you. I didn't show the editing for that. And at this point, I implemented that as just sort of XML, and it's a sort of a relatively straight sort of tree structure of combining these things in a logical order. But that's a really important aspect of it too. It's not just important that the user be able to make those fine adjustments. They also need to be able to add to that knowledge in this sort of logical descriptive way as well. And that's really important. And sort of in the Google Analytics way, it's you've got your custom report. Over time, you realize, for this particular situation, I need to start adding in. I need to keep looking at this other aspect, and so you add in that additional part of the report. So being able to constantly modify all that is really important. Nate.
Along those same lines, have you done any work in helping to evaluate what is related? Say tracking statistical significance in a change in one metric relative to another metric, so that you can make a suggestion that maybe this metric should be included in this.
There are really powerful tools that perform that sort of analysis already, and they're really domain specific. And those tools are constantly being developed, and they're an aid to developing that knowledge. And as much as I would love to contribute to that, the people who do that are way smarter than I am, and they understand their domains much better than I could. It's another way of adding sort of knowledge that you then apply to something like this. In a way, this is sort of like almost like a quick sort of scratch pad where you write a couple of things down that you sort of want to try to remember. This should be quick and dirty. That lets you make this sort of evaluation quickly. It allows you to feel confident in the situation, what you know about the situation, but it's not definitive. And that's this really important distinction. Joe?
Specifically with this example, at what point does this display structure go from being something that you can delve into to literally becoming an alert? And at what point, as you approach the 10 level, if you're sitting there watching your graph sort of grow towards the attend phase, you're effectively turning into an alert, are you not?
Except that
really one that's just not as psychologically jarring as a out of context and boom.
Well, and in fact, in this case, I never had it additionally actually trigger an alert. The system either already had an alerting system as part of it, or I relied on the user to use whatever alerting system they were comfortable with. The point of this was to let them know that an alert might be coming soon, so that when they didn't know, when they had time maybe to look in and do that monitoring, they could look and see what situations might need their attention soon. But this, it doesn't supplement, it doesn't replace an alert. Alerts still are used and they're still very necessary. And in fact, if something sort of pegs up and reaches the top and the user has no time to attend to it, in an alert they have to make this decision to cancel, ignore, or snooze. And this just stays high. It just stays there, but it doesn't pull them out of whatever they're doing. But that's also sort of a drawback, because it could stay up there for a week if for whatever reason they don't look at it. And we still need alerts, but this supplements them and enables them to use their time more wisely and essentially make better tactical decisions. Does that answer your question?
Well, sort of. I'm just sort of questioning or maybe challenging the efficacy of as it approaches that threshold and either stays right at or right below the threshold, and it's in this case the lines are growing darker or more solid for projections. I'm still going to look at that and think, I have to deal with this, or it's going to get bad, or I'm going to get an alert, and maybe this is something, maybe that's the point that I'm missing a little bit, but I think that in the solid middle ground between of heed, you are really just confirming that you don't have to do anything.
That's right.
And that as you approach the max of the boundaries of either direction is really where you need to consider something. But it's really, I'm questioning whether or not it's sort of a gradient. As you get closer, the closer it gets, it still isn't working.
Right. No, and actually, that's a really good point. At some point, yeah, the situation does exist, and you have to still make that tactical decision about whether or not you're going to turn to it or not. That's not unfortunately going to go away, and but instead, at least now you might know that it's coming, which is a win. But you're right. This isn't a it certainly doesn't eliminate the need for alarms. It doesn't eliminate the need for alerts. And you're right. At some point, you look at that and you see it's high. Users may simply respond that every time they respond as if it was an alarm that just went off. The only thing that's unique about, what's special about this is that the time when that occurs is a time when they're looking into it, which means there's time in their day, there's a moment for them to look into it, as opposed to they're doing something else and it comes at them. And that's the distinction. Cool. Oh, sorry, Jesse, there was another area I wanted to, you'd asked about the research. There's another thing you can do with this, which I hadn't really, that's very researchy. I don't know if I saw this figure in here. We can do, I talked about mapping it to different sizes, but there's more we can do with it. Each of these different situations are situations that we're looking out for, but I've talked about negative situations, looking out for something bad happening. The thing is, we also want to look out for really good things happening, an opportunity that we want to be able to take advantage of. And so if we just add one more dimension to this, which is just whether or not it's a good or a bad situation, it's a valence to it, we can use this, to approximate what we call machine affect. Essentially, it's as if the computer has a system that's like our affective or emotional system. Basically, if there are bad situations that seem to be if there are bad situations that exist, then the computer's equivalent to being sad. If there's a bad situation that seems to be coming, it's an equivalent of the computer becoming worried. If there's a good situation that exists, then it's equivalent of the computer being happy. And if there's a good situation that's appears to be approaching, then the computer is equivalent to being excited. And it's instead of trying to mimic human emotion, which is what all of affective research is focused on, this allows you to essentially let the computer have its own thing, its own equivalent, something that isn't the same as ours, isn't trying to communicate to us in the same way that by making it happy, but allows it now to start responding as if it had its own sort of emotional system. But that's a ways off. But it's very researchy. Jacob?
Talking about how simply I guess the first derivative is what you're showing. It gives us a lot of information. This may be tangential, but people looked at the best ways to incorporate this into the alerting. Alerts if it's above this threshold, or if it looks like it's getting there.
That's actually, yeah, that's a great point, actually. So, so let me actually reframe the question a little bit, or sort of the approach. Instead of trying to sort of catch as that first derivative is growing in a way, instead have another sensor that is not measuring the absolute value, but is measuring the first derivative, and now do the same sort of thresholding on the first derivative. And so now you can capture that and add that to your description of the situation. So as you just described it, it's not just when it's high, but when it's getting high. Then I want to pay attention to it. That's an or condition in this case, that either it's high or the first derivative is high. Then I want to then I want to pay attention. You put those together, and now you've got sort of the heed for that. And so that's a great question. Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you guys all for coming.